just unwilling to leave. It watches you carefully from the fence instead of disappearing into the trees like the others. And something about that moment feels strangely personal. Because deep down, humans instinctively understand what fear looks like in animals. So when a wild creature chooses not to run, even briefly, it feels emotionally important in ways difficult to explain logically. Maybe you've experienced this yourself. A robin that always appears near your garden. A crow waiting on the same rooftop every morning. A sparrow hopping unusually close while you drink coffee outside before sunrise. First, you dismiss it. Coincidence. Routine. Normal animal behavior. But then it keeps happening. Again. And again. Until eventually, a strange thought appears in your mind. What if the birds recognize me? Scientifically, many of them probably do. Researchers studying urban birds discovered certain species remember human faces, routines, walking patterns, and emotional behavior surprisingly well. Crows, pigeons, parrots, ravens, and even small songbirds adapt around individual humans constantly. Which means your backyard is not emotionally invisible to them. You are part of their environment, part of their map of safety and danger. And once a bird repeatedly decides your presence does not require an escape, something subtle changes psychologically. The bird stops treating you like a threat and begins to treat you like part of the landscape itself. That may sound small, but emotionally it's enormous, because trust from something wild feels radically different from approval from humans. Animals do not care about status, appearance, money, or performance. They care about safety, consistency, emotional predictability, which means the first sign birds in your yard may have chosen you is surprisingly simple. They stop fleeing immediately when you appear. And this is where the mystery begins becoming deeply personal. Because what happens next is even stranger. There's something deeply unsettling about being expected by wild animals. You open the back door at dawn, and the birds are already waiting. Perched on fences, telephone wires, tree branches overlooking the yard, watching silently as if they somehow knew you were about to appear. At first, it feels coincidental, but then the timing becomes impossible to ignore. Every morning, same hour, same places, same birds. Researchers studying bird cognition discovered birds are masters of pattern recognition. Survival depends on memorizing routines precisely. Feeding schedules, human movement, safe environments, danger zones. Which means if you consistently spend quiet time outdoors, nearby birds slowly begin incorporating your behavior into their daily expectations. Not emotionally at first, behaviorally. But humans are emotional storytellers by nature. Once a bird begins anticipating your arrival, the interaction immediately starts feeling personal. Because anticipation feels close to attachment, especially during lonely periods of life. Many people secretly describe their backyard birds as companions without ever saying it out loud. The cardinal that appears during morning coffee. The crow waiting near the driveway after work. The sparrows that gather whenever the garden hose turns on. Tiny routines, but emotionally comforting ones. And psychologists understand why. Repeated interactions with nature reduce stress hormones, emotional isolation, and feelings of invisibility significantly. Humans evolved alongside animal awareness for thousands of years. Our nervous systems still respond powerfully to peaceful interactions with wildlife, especially repeated interactions, because repetition creates familiarity, and familiarity slowly becomes an emotional connection. Researchers even discovered certain birds adjust feeding times around predictable humans specifically. In other words, the birds in your yard may already be organizing parts of their behavior around you, not because they belong to you, because they trust the rhythm of your presence. And maybe that's why these moments feel strangely healing. A world filled with noise, algorithms, and performance suddenly pauses, and something wild simply waits for you to arrive. But the most unbelievable part comes later. Because eventually, some birds begin communicating differently around trusted humans. And once you notice it, you'll never hear birdsong the same way again. Most people think birdsong is random background noise. Pretty, peaceful, meaningless. But to birds, sound is survival. Warnings, location signals, social communication, emotional information moving invisibly through the environment. And researchers discovered birds alter vocal behavior constantly depending on who or what enters their space. Certain calls signal danger. Others signal calm. Some birds even develop softer, more relaxed vocalizations around environments they consider consistently safe, which creates an emotionally fascinating possibility. The birds in your yard may sound different around you specifically. Maybe you've noticed this without fully understanding it. Birds become unusually vocal when you step outside peacefully. Soft chirping near your garden while you work quietly. A crow making strange clicking sounds from nearby branches instead of alarm calls. These tiny shifts feel emotionally significant because humans instinctively recognize tone even when we don't understand language. And birds are highly emotional communicators. Researchers studying parrots, corvids, and songbirds discovered vocalization patterns often reflect social comfort levels strongly. Meaning when birds sound relaxed around you, they probably are. One wildlife researcher described a crow that eventually greeted him with a specific vocal sound every morning after months of repeated peaceful interaction. Not trained behavior, recognition behavior. And perhaps that's the hidden emotional force behind bird trust. The moment something wild begins acting differently because of your presence. Not fearfully, comfortably. Humans react deeply to this because modern life often makes people feel emotionally invisible. Then suddenly nature itself begins responding uniquely to them. And that feeling is profoundly powerful. Not because birds are magical, but because being peacefully acknowledged by the natural world awakens something ancient inside the nervous system. A forgotten feeling. The feeling of belonging to the environment instead of merely existing beside it. But researchers didn't expect what they found next. Because birds don't only remember peaceful humans. Sometimes, they bring others too. One crow becomes two. Two become five. Then suddenly your backyard feels alive in ways it never did before. Different birds arrive regularly, returning repeatedly, lingering longer than expected. Most people assume this is simply food-related behavior. And partially, that's true. Birds communicate resource safety constantly. But researchers studying crows and urban bird populations discovered something far more complex. Birds socially observe each other's reactions to humans. If one bird repeatedly behaves calmly around a specific person, nearby birds often become less fearful too. In other words, trust spreads. Not emotionally in a human sense. Behaviorally. But emotionally, the effect feels extraordinary. Because your yard slowly transforms into a place wildlife no longer fears instinctively. And perhaps that's one of the deepest signs birds have chosen you. The environment around you begins feeling emotionally alive instead of empty. More movement, more sound, more presence. Researchers discovered exposure to birdsong alone improves human mental health significantly. Natural soundscapes reduce anxiety and increase feelings of emotional stability. Maybe because humans evolved hearing birds constantly. For most of history, birdsong meant safety. A functioning ecosystem. Life continues normally. Silence, by contrast, often signaled danger. Which means when birds willingly gather near you repeatedly, your nervous system interprets it subconsciously as acceptance from the environment itself. And maybe that's why people become emotionally attached to backyard birds so easily. The birds are not merely decorating the space. They're transforming the emotional atmosphere of it. One elderly man described his backyard birds as proof the world still remembered him. That sentence disturbed psychologists researching loneliness because it revealed something painfully true about modern life. Many people feel profoundly unseen. Then one morning, a flock of birds begins waiting outside their window daily, and suddenly existence feels connected again. Not through technology, through presence, through attention, through something alive. But what happens next is even stranger. Because some birds eventually stop treating humans as outsiders entirely. There's a huge difference between a bird tolerating your presence. Relaxation is vulnerability. And vulnerability is dangerous in nature. Which means when birds begin acting naturally around you, something profound has shifted psychologically. You are no longer categorized as immediate risk. Researchers studying animal behavior discovered prey species constantly monitor environmental safety levels through tension behaviors. Quick head movements, sudden flight reactions, constant scanning. No performance, no expectations, just coexistence. Perhaps that's why people often describe backyard bird encounters during emotionally difficult periods of life, especially bird eyes. Cold, focused, unreadable. A crow staring from a rooftop, a hawk watching silently from a branch, even tiny songbirds tilting their heads as if studying you carefully. Humans instinctively react strongly to eye contact because eye contact signals awareness. And awareness changes everything. Researchers discovered many birds use direct visual observation to assess human behavior continuously. They study movement patterns, emotional predictability, and environmental safety through repeated visual monitoring. Meaning when a bird stares at you, it often genuinely is evaluating you, not emotionally judging you like a human would, but deciding whether your behavior fits safety patterns it already recognizes. And maybe that's why repeated eye contact with birds feels strangely intimate, because humans rarely expect to be individually noticed by wildlife. Yet birds notice far more than we realize. The crow outside your window may already know your routine. The robin near your garden may recognize your movement patterns. The sparrows near your porch may understand your schedule better than some neighbors do. And suddenly the natural world feels less passive than it did before. More observant, more aware, more alive. Researchers studying crows found they not only recognize human faces but teach those recognitions socially to younger birds. Imagine that for a moment. A wild animal capable of remembering you long after you stop thinking about it. That realization changes people emotionally because memory feels sacred, especially memories from something wild. And maybe that's the hidden emotional truth beneath all human fascination with birds. We are deeply moved by anything in nature that appears capable of truly seeing us. Not humanity generally, us specifically, but the most emotional sign comes later. Because eventually, the birds stop acting like visitors and begin acting like your presence belongs there. One morning you wake up, and the birds aren't there. No chirping, no movement in the trees, no crow on the fence, nothing. And unexpectedly, the silence feels personal. That's when you realize something important. The birds were never background noise to you anymore. They had become part of your emotional world. Researchers studying human attachment to wildlife discovered repeated exposure to familiar birds creates measurable emotional bonding patterns over time. Humans begin recognizing individual behaviors, routines, and even personalities in recurring birds. And once emotional familiarity forms, absence suddenly feels heavy, like noticing a missing voice in a room you thought was empty. Perhaps this is the clearest sign birds in your yard have truly chosen you. Their presence changed how the space feels emotionally. The yard became alive through relationships, not ownership, not control, mutual familiarity. And maybe humans need that feeling more than ever now. Modern life has gradually disconnected people from nature. Most humans spend entire days inside artificial environments disconnected from weather, silence, animal movement, and living ecosystems. Then one morning, birds begin waiting outside their window regularly. And slowly, the world feels real again. Not perfect, real. The morning air matters again. Sunrise matters again. Stillness matters again. Because birds force awareness gently. A cardinal perched quietly during coffee. A crow observing rain from a wire. A robin singing before dawn. Tiny reminders that life continues moving outside human stress constantly. And perhaps that's why bird trust feels almost spiritual sometimes. Not because birds are supernatural, but because they reconnect humans to something ancient they forgot they needed. Presence without performance. Attention without judgment. Connection without words. The birds in your yard chose you long before you consciously realized it. Not because you own the space, but because something in your behavior taught them they could exist peacefully beside you. And honestly, that may be one of the most beautiful forms of trust left in the modern world. Have you ever noticed a bird returning to your yard so often that it started feeling less like coincidence and more like recognition?